Welcome, David and Martha. And David, I do have the slides that you sent me this morning ready to put up, so I will put them up now and you can get started.
Okay, you can put the first one up and I'll just talk a bit and then tell you when to change it.
Great, thanks.
Case reports are kind of an unusual, I don't want to say historical anachronism because they're making a comeback these days, but when I was involved with health research reporting guidelines, I was involved one of the initial consort members back in the late 1990s. The whole emphasis was to try to begin to wrap our heads around what the evidence was. And so in terms of the first guideline was consort for the randomized controlled trial. And the issue that immediately emerged is the published data in the best medical journals was inconsistent. So you couldn't tell, you couldn't extract information, reliable information from a published trial because it hadn't been reported properly. So that led to the whole emphasis of the health research reporting guidelines. And in 2010, when I was co-founding yet another medical journal with some colleagues, I decided that the good thing to do would be to do case reports because I couldn't find out a lot of information, and more importantly than anything, it seemed like a way to begin to reach across specialty boundaries and also a way to reach around the globe. And I thought at that point I was interested in something that was going to be global. And so I called up my friends at Consort and the Equator Network and said, and the Equator Network, for those of you who don't know, is now kind of the library that has 318 reporting guidelines. It's housed at Oxford. It's a well-established, credible organization. And I just kind of went up to the librarian there, Aveta Samara, and said, I'd like to check out the case report guideline template so I could use it for this new journal. And she said, well, we don't really have them. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, I don't know. We've mostly been focused on research, which, of course, we all know is a surrogate marker for effectiveness in clinical practice. So I talked with Doug Altman and David Moeller, and they said, well, we'll support you in creating guidelines for case reports if you're willing to set up an architectural framework structure rather than a guideline. We don't want to see a guideline for headaches or a guideline for acupuncture because we need to have the general first so that then these data can be comparable. So I said, okay, so we'll do that. And so with a group of people, some of whom you know, everybody here on this call knows, we began working on it. And by 2013, which is lightning speed in the health research reporting guideline community, we had a guideline for case reports. And we published those in 2013. They're called the CARE Guidelines. And we published them. And subsequently, they've been endorsed by about 300 medical journals. They're translated into 9 languages. And we think we're on the way to making these a standard, not just because the guidelines have been. It's been kind of my passion for the last 3 or 4 years, and I've been teaching case report writing workshops almost nonstop. And I actually think they do make a difference. We're in the process of going through a transition right now. We have a series of online tools and templates that are coming out. We're publishing what's called an E&E document, which takes each one of the items in the CARE checklist and offers an example and a further explanation. And so it feels a little bit like we're off to the races. And it turns out that case reports are making a comeback these days as people realize that personalized, individualized approaches to medicine may have some value in an era where we relied on group statistics and group populations, if for no other reason than to simplify the conundrum of data. Case reports are now back on the map, and I think it's interesting to look back at the history of all of this. In 1950s, case reports were part of the medical literature, all the medical literature. And then in 1962, from the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which is a modification to the FDA Act, which was based on the thalidomide problem that had emerged, the FDA put in requirements for pre-approval testing for efficacy and safety for all pharmaceutical products and medical devices. This had not been the case beforehand. And so that single impetus there led to the choosing of the randomized controlled trial as the best research tool for assessing effectiveness and safety and assessing effectiveness from a causality point of view rather than from just an association point of view. It hasn't worked out exactly that way because causality is much trickier than just a randomized controlled trial. But that led to the rise of the randomized controlled trial and the demise of case reports. But as we began to notice some of the problems in the evidence pyramid, we've begun to think maybe there's other ways to look at things. And for all of us who are involved in integrated therapy, we know that we do not have the patent protection engine of conventional pharmaceutical industry. And we will never have enough randomized controlled trials to change the paradigms. And of course, we all know it's not just about the evidence, it's also about the belief. So case reports are going to be a valuable tool for integrative therapies as long as they're systematically collected and as long as the data in them is aggregated and reported. So the basic...
David, sorry to interrupt. Did you want Beth to advance some of your slides?
In just a minute, I've got one more statement, then we're going to advance the slide. So case reports, keep this in mind. Case reports are a story, but they have to have data. Now I need the next slide. God we trust, but everybody else has to show data. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a drug for a disease, or we're talking about massage for well-being, or we're talking about acupuncture, whatever we're talking about, we need to have a way to show data. And my goal with the care guideline was begin to take the data of case reports and change them from anecdotes into evidence. And so the next slide. This has been done. This has been thought about deeply by some very talented people who are much brighter than I am. Jan van der Broek in the Netherlands wrote an eloquent article in 2001 in the Annals on independent case reports and case series. And he said, you can read it here, the case reports have a high sensitivity for detecting novelty. And good case reporting demands a clear focus to make explicit to the audience why a particular observation is important in the context of existing knowledge. So this was in 2001. Next slide, please. Everybody knows about evidence-based medicine, and everybody rails against it. I would point out that the founder of contemporary evidence-based medicine is probably the man David Sackett, and he died last year. But in 1996, he wrote in the BMJ that without clinical expertise, that means the skill all clinicians have from being in practice, practice risks becoming tyrannized by evidence. And by that he meant research evidence. For even excellent external evidence may be inappropriate for individual patients. And then Gordon Guyatt, who's at Hamilton, McMaster's in Hamilton, Ontario, and has developed a system for translating research evidence into practice recommendations called GRADE, has pointed out that high-quality evidence does not necessarily imply strong recommendations, and that strong recommendations can arise from low-quality evidence, or we could say case reports. And then in a wonderful quote I discovered recently from Yogi Berra, in theory there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. So next slide. This is the history we were talking about in 1962, the introduction of the randomized controlled trial for pre-approval drug testing. And in 1980, they had all this data around. And so Richard Peto from the UK began developing a technique called systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And so in 1996, the consort guidelines were developed for randomized controlled trials. In 2006, which I don't have on here, the Equator Network was formed as a library at home for health research reporting guidelines. And in 2013, we published the care guideline for case reports. So the next slide. So what are health research reporting guidelines and how are they developed? The first thing you do is you develop a needs assessment. Like, do you actually need a guideline? If you don't need it, why develop it? And then you go through what's called the Delphi process, where you consult with experts in a series a series of question rounds. Then from that, you develop some documents, develop a consensus meeting of some of those experts, and you hopefully come up with a draft of a health research reporting guideline. Some guidelines have taken decades to put together. And so then you publish the health research reporting guidelines. We were lucky. We got to publish these in 7 medical journals in 2013, but we also got to present them at a peer review and biomedical publication conference sponsored by the BMJ and JAMA in Chicago in 2013. Then once the guidelines are out there and published, you then try to get endorsement from journals. And so all of the BMC journals have endorsed these guidelines. I've been working with Daniel Shanahan there. And then you want authors to begin to utilize them for submission. And then once you've got all that done and people start to publish case reports, you want to begin to track the publications and see if they affect the quality of case reports and ultimately improve patient care. So what are the care guidelines? We'll go to the next slide. So it's a narrative and it's data. And so the narrative tells a story that includes the case, which is an episode of care in some patients which have multiple medical problems and they have been seen multiple times and gotten better and then gotten worse and then gotten better again. And it needs to have a discussion of the rationale for any conclusion. So some of these are fairly straightforward: title, keywords, and abstract. And the reason you want to pay particular attention to these is you want to enable people to be able to find them when they search. So, and the title, when I'm teaching case report writing, the title seems elusively simple, but it takes a long time to come up with a good title that actually clearly defines what it is you're trying to look for. This sequence here is a little bit different than the care checklist that's on the website, and this because it's out of teaching. The first thing I do in a case report, once we've selected a case report writing effort, once we've selected a case, we get a title. We don't worry about the keywords of the abstracts yet. The first thing we go to is the timeline, and we try to depict important milestones in this case in a table or figure. We've now published a couple dozen case reports where in the acknowledgement section it explicitly says that they follow the care guidelines. The timeline is a big deal. The timeline, in my mind, is to a case report what a table of contents is to a book. It'll tell you where you want to go, what the main points are, but it doesn't give you the detail. So the title, the introduction, and the timeline set the stage for the case report, and all these things that are highlighted in blue beginning on this slide with the patient information, demographic, chief complaint, medical and family history, comorbidities in a narrative come in, and they may have appeared in a truncated form on the timeline, then followed by the clinical findings. And then the next slide, please. The clinical findings, of course, are like the physical exam. What did you do to make the diagnosis? It could have been a physical evaluation, like tongue diagnosis, pulse diagnosis. It could have been a radiological study. It could have been a pathology study. It could have been a laboratory. And then when you have all this pulled together, what did you do about it? So then you have therapeutic interventions. They may be drugs. They may be preventive. They may be self-care. They may be referral to a colleague. How did you administer the intervention? What was the dosage if it was a medicine? Or even if it wasn't a medicine, how often did you do it? What was the duration? Were there any changes in the intervention? Did the patient request changes? All these sorts of things. And then follow-up and outcomes. And, of course, some therapies, of course, are going to have outcomes on the first visit, and other ones, it takes a little bit longer. A good case report generally follows a duration of time so that it's reasonable to assume that there was an endpoint of this episode of care. Then and only then, you write the discussion section saying why you think what happened happened. If you read a lot of case reports over the years, I probably read, I don't know, 500 or so case reports. A lot of people like to start with the discussion section. So when you pick up some case reports, you open them to read them, and you find that you go through pages where they're telling you why something is the best thing since sliced bread. And then near the end, you find out what the data is. The other thing we've included in the care guidelines is the patient perspective. that the patient should share his or her perspective or experience whenever possible. This is usually a sidebar. It's usually no more than a couple paragraphs. The last thing is informed consent, which you don't have to actually write the case report, but you do have to have it to publish in almost every medical journal that I know of. So next slide, please. This is that information. You may not be able to read it, but it's all available at care-statement.org, which is about to be relaunched in the next 2 weeks with some updates. But it's just divided as a checklist. So what does this checklist do? This checklist allows an author to see if they have everything they need, and it also allows an editor to see if the case report that was submitted has everything they want, if they endorse the care guidelines, and that the 2 journals that I'm an editor for, we send it out with 2 reviewers along with a review form so that they can fill this out at the same time, and it helps guide reviewers. I mean, well, unfortunately, we have a situation now where there's no formal training yet for editors, and there's no formal training for peer reviewers. And some of us are in the process right now of changing that to try to, so we can develop some qualifications so that people who are empowered to become good editors and good peer reviewers. So next slide. The next slide is how does this affect integrative medicine? I would maintain that case reports systematically collected and aggregated can provide real-world evidence of effectiveness and offer examples of interprofessional collaboration. And I would also say that I don't think any of us on this at this meeting know that the therapies that we're never going to have enough randomized controlled trials to convince the skeptics. And just as in a research portfolio, you generally want to have expert opinion, case reports, testimonials, and everything as the basis from which to do case series, observational studies, randomized controlled trials. The leap to jump in with randomized controlled trials in many cases is misguided and ill-informed, and case reports can provide a good starting step. So in summary, one more slide. I want to talk about what I think case reports can offer. They can provide early signals of effectiveness, harms, and costs. They can inform clinical practice and improve clinical reasoning. I've seen this happen time and time again when I've written case reports with groups, particularly students. Provide feedback on clinical practice guidelines, and whether they're formal clinical practice guidelines or informal clinical practice guidelines handed down from faculty and experts. Case reports can either validate or call them into question, and case reports can also generate testable hypotheses for clinical research. That's everything that I have.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was fantastic, David. Really good. Martha, did you want to chime in here?
I do. There are a couple of things I'd like to add, particularly as regards the role of case reports in integrative healthcare. I think, and David, thank you for reinforcing something that I've been saying for years, that prematurely jumping into RCTs for a lot of therapies that don't have a foundation of descriptive and observational evidence is kind of misguided, and I think it has led to poorly designed randomized controlled trials with either misleading or inconclusive results. And I personally think we should have a moratorium on systematic reviews that say more evidence is needed, or there aren't enough high quality RCTs for us to render judgment on these. But I think particularly for integrative healthcare, one of the really valuable roles that case reports can play is really providing a thorough description. One of the standards of reporting research is that your study is reported in sufficient detail for someone else to be able to replicate it. I think that describing what it is that we're doing in clinical practice is critically important. And just because I'm familiar, with massage therapy, I'll use that as an example where people have a lot of different tools to choose from, can incorporate and combine these in a lot of different ways. And so to say that massage therapy was applied for 30 minutes doesn't really describe in enough detail what people are actually doing. So I think describing both a thorough description of the intervention, but also having demographic information about the practitioners. And this was one of the recommendations of a group of 2 massage therapists who have proposed adapting the care guidelines specifically for massage therapy. And one of the things that they recommend adding, are both thorough description of the intervention, such that it could be replicated, along with demographic descriptions of the practitioner, particularly what kind of training did they get, how long have they been in practice, because one of the questions that I think we want to look at in a lot of our fields is how much does the degree of training and experience make a difference in outcomes? And in some fields they've found that novice practitioners do just as well and sometimes better than more experienced practitioners. We've never really, I think, asked that question systematically in a lot of our disciplines. So that's my 2 cents on this.
And I would like to add something. I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put the citations for another thing that the Equator has done is they have better reporting of interventions. A template for intervention description and replication is called Tidier. It's a checklist and guidelines, and I'm right now working with the yoga community to develop a Tidier extension for all yoga research, which has the same conundrum that Martha just described about massage, where somebody says, I went to a yoga intervention, what happened?
Right. What does that mean?
What flavor of yoga was it? And so there's this EPIC questionnaire that's been developed by Eric Brossel and Crystal Park or Ronnie Elway in the yoga community, but now we're going to take it and try to leverage that into the bigger health research community by creating a Tidier guideline, and I'm getting ready to just type that citation in here for everybody.
Great, thanks for that, David. I think maybe we'll open it up to questions. People have questions.
Yeah, this is Jim. I have a question for David. David, I'd like to know what you think about kind of aggregation of case reports and a sort of systematic review of case reports, and whether that's a kind of a valid way to kind of strengthen the evidence given in case reports by taking multiple case reports on the same subject. This is an approach that's been taken by Dr. Ernst in a kind of a critical way of complementary medicine, kind of demonstrating possible, adverse effects of chiropractic and other modalities, spinal manipulation. But I'm wondering if it could also be done in a positive way, and whether or not you think that this is a valid kind of research method.
I think it's a very valid research method, and I would point everybody to the Andrew Vickers study in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2012. There was a systematic review of the individual records of 17,000 patients who participated in acupuncture for osteoarthritis. It's one of the great papers out there. 17,000 individual subject records from randomized controlled trials. Now, they weren't exactly case reports, but they were analyzed individually, and he found that acupuncture worked better than sham acupuncture, which worked better than placebo. It was great. So I'm all in favor of systematic review. But the thing is, in order to do a systematic review and then in order to do a meta-analysis, you have to have a framework so that you're comparing apples to apples. And so I think that guidelines provide a tool for comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges.
Yeah, it certainly would facilitate doing reviews in a more systematic way when you have everything categorized like that.
And Jim, I think there's some validity to that. I think that there's, I think part of the value of case reports is in the richness of their description. And it's important to remember that people do write case reports for, for different reasons or to, to illustrate. People can have different objectives in writing case reports, and it may be to report an adverse event, it may be to report something unusual, it may be to give a sort of textbook example of something. And so I think there are always going to be some limits in how you want to standardize for the purposes of aggregation, but I think this is where having open data repositories can be a huge help, because if you have access to the data and researchers are willing to make the de-identified raw data freely available, that can facilitate the kind of study that David was just using as an example. And it's also one of the goals of the case report repository, the Case Re3 repository. We really encourage people to submit their raw data, as de-identified patient data.
Well, I just want to play devil's advocate a bit here. So isn't the major limitation, even if one was to aggregate case reports, is that you're never going to see a case report about a negative patient outcome, right? So it's like cherry picking the successful patient.
Absolutely. I vehemently disagree with you there, Bo, because one of the big reasons that people do write case reports is to report adverse events. That is a negative outcome.
Well, I mean, where it was completely uninteresting. There were no adverse events. It just didn't work.
I think that's worthy of publication, and it, might. I think it would take a. I think it would take a brave practitioner to write that, but I think that it's important for journals to publish negative results, and we all know that there's publication bias there. Where even if somebody were brave enough to write that case report, they might have a hard time getting it published.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm really getting at, is that if, we would take this aggregation approach, which I think is a great idea in theory, but the big limitation is this, that you're sort of cherry picking out the successful patient treatment examples, and that'll be.
Well, this is also one of the goals of the repository, because it's basically one of the, I think the advantages of it is that it is a place where people can submit what would otherwise become gray literature. And so my hope is that over time we will accumulate those kinds of studies as well. And I also think it goes to a point that David was making earlier. I think case reports as a form of educational assessment. David was mentioning the helping people to articulate and define, refine their clinical reasoning or clinical rationale for why they're doing what they're doing. I think case reports are a really great way of assessing what students have learned, and they make a fabulous capstone project for training programs.
Yeah, in fact, we built that into our entry-level doctoral program here at QCOM, so I totally agree with you.
And there's no penalty there for reporting negative results, I think.
You
this
pointed
is
out
Jim again. I'd like to I agree with it that the kind of the cherry picking aspect, prevents us from seeing kind of generalizing to the greater population the effectiveness of an intervention. But that cherry picking aspect can also be kind of turned to advantage by identifying, where kind of individualized care and what kinds of patients and what their characteristics are, where the intervention does work, and where if you have enough case reports, you start to get a sense for what kinds of patients this intervention does work for, and that in itself is valuable information which you may not get out of a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's almost like if you did that aggregation study, you'd have to build that in. Are there similarities between these patients and their presentations that are telling us something?
That's where I think incorporating the patient's perspective can be really helpful there.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
This is Mitch. I've certainly spoken at length about what I'm going to say with David and with Martha, but I guess it's worth everyone else hearing. There's certainly, and as has been presented today, some very good reasons for having case reports, and there's some good reasons and maybe some not so good reasons for aggregating them. But I think what is missing from the guidelines is the perspective that you need, which would come if the denominator problem were fully disclosed. So what I mean by that is this case just exemplary of what they've seen? Is this case serendipitous? Or is this case just a cherry-picked case? So one patient thrives out of 1,000, the other 999 die from this therapy. All right, that's different than if this was just some unusual kind of thing that was worth everybody hearing about. Some completely serendipitous kind of case. If this kind of information were to be made available, it would allow the reader to put these these cases, give them some perspective at least.
Yeah, David, Martha, do you want to respond to that? I think it's an interesting point.
Well, I think it's there's a lot of challenges with case reports, and that's one of them. Another one is that electronic medical records, it's very difficult to collect this denominator information because electronic medical records are about managing the business of medicine, not really about the clinical practice of medicine. And so the wrong clinical data is not available. And so if in an ideal world, all patients everywhere, you'd be able to aggregate everything in a push of a button. You'd be able to look at that denominator function right away. And of course, the other problem is that many people who are actually in practice and have a lot of case reports that they could write, what am I going to do? I'm going to go say, by the way, you're using one electronic medical system. Here's another one. Why don't you take all of your data, your raw data, and just drop it in here? It's not that. Writing a case report is extremely difficult and time-consuming. Tracking down the record, sorting out the mistakes in the record, contacting the individual practitioners and finding out, did you really do that, or when did you stop that? Or they said, I gave a patient aloe, and the patient said, I never took any aloe. And the practitioner says, well, actually, I just recommended it, and I knew they didn't take it. So there's all sorts of problems there, and so I share what you're saying, Mitch, because I think it's really hard that I've been working at this for so long and have so few published case reports. So I'm interested in what Martha's talking about in terms of a repository. I'm interested in it being systematic, but I'm interested in increasing the denominator. And for me, that's the whole point behind aggregation, is increasing the denominator.
And Mitch, I think that I would agree with that. And I think it goes to what I was saying earlier about in the introduction to the case report, the author could state their intention of you know, why they're writing it or what their objective in sharing this is, you know, whether it's this is a textbook example, this is very typical of what I have in my practice, or this was an unusual event that I think is interesting and noteworthy, and I'd like to, you know, share it with other people in case you run into something similar. You know, here's something new that I'm trying in my practice, and here's how it turned out. You know, there I think, you know, doing more of a case series might be helpful, and that's clearly, you know, a next step that somebody could take. I also think encouraging practitioners to, a lot of case reports get written retrospectively, especially the adverse event type, because nobody plans to have an adverse event, right? So encouraging practitioners to be using standardized tools for measuring progress could, I think, really could make it a lot easier for people to write case reports retrospectively. But I also think there's great value in planning ahead. You know, if somebody comes into your practice with something unusual, maybe you think it could make a case report, go ahead and prospectively design it and plan it, and, you know, see if the client or patient is interested in doing that with you. And there again, I think that's something that you have to report, because maybe patient engagement is influencing your you know, potentially positive results that you might get.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Martha. In fact, that could be a good topic for one of these meetings in terms of discussing what sort of instruments are suitable in clinical practice for collecting outcome data.
Mm-hmm.
They're very different than the type of instruments that would be appropriate for a research study, really much more detailed and not, you know, patient-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe just throw that out to the group as a potential topic for our next meeting to segue off this.
I'm personally, I'm a big fan. Go ahead.
With the care guidelines, now we're recommending that everybody use the promise forms. They're free. They're online. They're from the NIH. They're scored automatically. Patients can fill them out in less than a minute, and you can begin to track progress on things like pain intensity from visit to visit to visit. So these outcome tools are ready, and they're available for research and general practice right now.
I was going to say I'm a big fan of things like the Defense and Veterans Pain Rating Scale. That's, you know, freely available, easy to use. Other things I think are great that really lend themselves to clinical practice are things like just keeping a symptom diary or activities of daily living.
Right. Yeah, like the MyMop instrument encompasses
exactly
the self-outcome. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think activities of daily living is a really important one, because it's such a functional measure, and I think clinically, in terms of addressing chronic conditions like chronic pain, the emphasis is really moving away from decreasing everybody's pain rating to 0 on the numeric rating scale to increasing people's ability to function in their daily life.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valuable point.
You know, in terms of impact, that's huge.
Yeah, it definitely is. And studies have shown that patients will still continue to come back for treatment even though they're not getting an improvement in their main complaint because of these other benefits.
Well, exactly. I was going to say activities of daily living, I think that's a very patient-centered measure.
So, David, are you experienced with these PROMISE outcome measures?
Oh yeah, I've been to a PROMISE boot camp. The NIH developed them. They turned them loose. The center is at Northwestern. David Stella is the leader of that. It's a matter of fact, the Functional Medicine Institute at the Cleveland Clinic is just going to start incorporating PROMISE scores and testing into every patient visit at the Cleveland Clinic. It's easy and it's free, and it takes a minute.
Right.
You can do a Promise Global Health Assessment in a minute at every visit with every patient.
I think Bastyr is looking at integrating some of the Promise measures into their clinic.
Who was that, Martha? Sorry?
Bastyr University.
Oh, Bastyr. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Bastyr was one of the participants in the Samueli Chronic Pain Breakthrough Collaborative that I was faculty for last year. And one of the changes that they decided to make was to begin integrating some of those measures into their electronic health records to just facilitate research.
Yeah, very interesting.
In their clinic.
So unfortunately, we have come to the hour. We will table the NCCIH Advisory Committee meetings agenda item, but as far as future presentations are concerned, this one might be of significant interest to the group, and I'm wondering if David and Martha, you'd be interested in reporting about outcome instruments that can be used in clinical practice, including the Promise, which I think is one that clinicians are probably least aware of.
Sure.
David, can we get more of your time?
Yeah, that was I'm very interested in Promise. This Promise was designed to answer the very question that you just raised.
Right. That question being?
Well, what's an easy-to-use, standardized instrument that everybody could use in their practice and not have to sort through which form do I use for this? You know, you can go to one place, one library, find them all, and you can use a computer adaptive model if you want to, or you can use a standardized one. Either way, that's fine.
Oh. So, David, would you be interested in presenting to the group about this, about the Promise guidelines?
Yeah, I can probably do it. I don't consider myself an expert in it, but I can try to become more knowledgeable about the strengths and weaknesses of it, though.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, that would be great. And David, I'll follow up with you. The next research working group meeting is November 7th.
All right. Well, it's been a fascinating presentation, really lively discussion. So thank you so much, David and Martha, for presenting on that. And we are really going to look forward to hearing more about this when you present at our next meeting.
Thank you both. Thank you, David and Martha, and thank you everybody for being on the call and your participation. I will have the notes out to you and let me know if you need anything by email, and we'll talk to you November 7th. Okay.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. Thanks, everyone.